Hello, how are we doing? Okay, um, I want to record um, the lecture that finishes the material from the Guns, Germs, and Steel book so that we have sort of gone over it together, and it's a lot of material and a lot of detail. And I hope you're getting the sort of the broader vision of what the author is trying to do, right? Now, so far, um, the author has previously discussed why so many wild plants were unsuitable for domestication. And he gives us, a fascinating series of reasons and eliminates some and others and this kind of a thing, to help us understand why, of the vast plethora of plants that exist out there, um, only a few ultimately get domesticated. And it's not for lack of trying, not for a lack of intelligence or anything like that by individual people, but he's trying to ground it in the objective reality of the plants themselves and what they bring to the table. He's not going to try and do the same thing with animals, right? And so he will end up with animals. He's given several chapters to plants. He's now going to give us one chapter to animals to try and give us a similar point of view as to why, ultimately, what he's concerned with explaining um, why it is that the Fertile Crescent um, becomes sort of the initial place for the explosion of farming and food production, and why it spreads from there over such a wide period, and why other areas will come in slightly later or not come in at all, having the environment that would seem like it would be like able to do this. Okay, so let's see. Um, So, first thing he's going to do is separate off large mammals from smaller mammals. And he's going to say, look, um, there's a host of small mammals, like rabbits, for example, um, that have provided us with food, clothing, fur, things like that, right? He says, but I'm not really interested in that. He's not really interested in that because he's really interested in his basic theme of guns, germs, and steel, how it is that certain civilizations took off and expanded and developed and modernized, if you want to use that term here, developed much earlier than others. And once they had that advantage, they have used that advantage to dominate other societies in the world. And the other societies looking on, say, well, wait a second. We as individual human beings are as smart as you are. Why is it that this has come to this particular result? The book starts with what is called Yali's question, and Yali is the guy on the beach in New Guinea who says, "Hey, you know, you're no smarter than me. Why is it that you people have seemingly developed stuff that is mind-boggling to us, but I mean, we can understand it in all these things, but how did you get to that point?" And so ultimately he's trying to answer that larger issue, but what he's saying is you have to go back to that ultimate, remember, the ultimate and the proximate causes. And the ultimate cause, at the top was the east-west axis, but then right underneath that was many suitable species, right? Okay. Um, and that's exactly where we are right now, right? So he says, I'm going to concentrate on um, large herbivore mammals, and let's try and understand why it is that a certain small number of animals have been domesticated while the rest have not. And even animals that look like they should be able to be domesticated are not. Take, for example, a zebra. It looks like a horse, but for some reason, either the Africans were incapable of doing it, and he will address those issues, right? Or else the animal itself was resistant to the process of domestication. So he gives us the fact that there are, you know, plants. He says there's 200,000 plants out there. you gradually have to work down till you get a number of plants that are potential candidates for domestication. So for animals, and let me see, I didn't write that number down. I think that he's going to say, all right, can't find it right now. I think it was something like maybe 143 large animals. I, don't challenge me on that. You can find it yourself, right? He says, the number is large, but not immense, not astonishing, right? And he goes on to say, from this group of relatively small, big terrestrial mammals, um, he comes up with 14 species that have been domesticated. And he looks at them and he starts the list with what he calls the major five, which are what? Sheep, goat, cow, pig, and horse. So those are the five major domesticated animals that have literally spread all over the world, and were sort of the initial source and the impulse, together with the domestication of plants in the Fertile Crescent, that gave them an advance over other areas. He then lists 9 others, right? Yeah, 9. He calls them the minor 9. And to understand why he calls them the minor 9, um, these are important as livestock, but only as livestock for people in limited parts of the globe. They haven't become universally applicable across the board. And they are 2 forms of camels: the Arabian camel and the Bactrian camel. I think the Arabian camel has 1 hump. The Bactrian camel in India and that part of the world has 2 humps. The llama slash alpaca, which are, I believe, are sort of variations on camels, as it were, right? Donkeys, reindeer, water buffalo, and yak. And I was going to look yak up on the dictionary to see what it looks like. I think it's a very, very hairy kind of an animal, like a cow or something like that, right? Okay, so he said, look, out of the whole possibility of 100 and what 43, 83, something like that, animals that are out there, which is not huge compared to the amount of plant diversity that's out there. There's only 14 of them that have indeed been domesticated. And he says, okay, now wait a second. Understand what I mean by domestication, right? And I think we went through this before, right? So domestication involves wild animals that will be captured, tamed, and then ultimately transformed into something more useful for human beings through breeding, through raising them, right? He says, okay, so you might say, well, what about elephants? Which first time I read it, before I got to where he explains elephants, I thought, dude, are you forgetting something? What about elephants, right? Because I mean, I've been in Bali and seen elephants used to pick up logs and carry them and being directed, and they're like trucks. He says, now with elephants, what you have are animals who were born in the wild, but have been tamed, but never domesticated. In other words, the fine line there is the ability to make that animal mate with a fellow animal of the same species and have offspring, and that's when the process of domestication really begins to move forward, as humans can begin to engage in selection as to which of the offspring to eat or whatever, right? And which to save for breeding purposes, so that you, in fact, improve the breed from your own point of view, from the point of view of the humans that are using the animal. He said, elephants haven't done that. Elephants, any elephant that you see like that in a circus or elsewhere, right, as trained and as intelligent as they are, have been captured in the wild, brought back, maybe when they were fairly young, and it was easy to indoctrinate them. These kinds of things, right? But they are different. What's important there is to understand what his definition of domestication is, which is equal for both plants and animals. And what's critical there is the idea that domestication will ultimately change the species itself, right? We saw that in his marvelous discussion of peas, how peas, when they're on the pod and they ripen, they open up and they explode out. So the peas are shot because they're seeds. They're shot far from the mother plant to be able to propagate in a larger area than if they just fell to the ground and suddenly found themselves competing with each other. But there were peas that were mutants that didn't do that, right? Humans then begin selecting for that characteristic and planting that, and ultimately removing the prior genetic characteristic to shoot open like that. And maybe they appear once in a while like a mutation in the future. In any case, so truly domesticated animals then differ in various ways from their wild ancestors. And he says this occurs through two processes, which really we've kind of looked at with plants. There's a bit of repetition here, but it is interesting to see how what's true for plants is equally going to be true for animals as well in this game of domestication. First of all, what I just mentioned was that human selection of individual specimens, individual members, that selection will select for those animals that are more useful to humans, take them for breeding purposes, and the rest are slaughtered for meat, for skins, for leather, whatever, right? However you use them, right? So human selection. The second is, again, as we saw with Darwin, natural selection operating in human environments, right? Okay, now, if you recall, his discussion of this point with plants was that in the wild, a large seed may actually be at a disadvantage in a difficult terrain, whereas a smaller seed that grows a smaller plant that comes to fruition sooner drops its seed sooner, whereas the larger seed may demand more and not receive it and actually die and wilt before it has a chance to do that. But then when the farmer prepares the land, irrigates it, all of those steps involved, and he puts the large seeds that he's selected, he will then select for larger seeds. The smaller seeds get eaten, get used, maybe given to the chickens. We have chickens there, this kind of a thing, right? So the same thing is going to be true for animals, right? What may be an advantage for an animal in the wild may be a disadvantage for an animal in captivity. So, for example, what's the word? Can't think of it right now. But the idea of being, an animal can be angry, violent, whatever, or can be sort of docile. There it is. There's the word I was looking for. Docile. Do you know the word docile? Docile means an animal that is quiet and peaceful and, like a dog that comes up and puts its head, its snout in your hands and wants to be petted, or a cat that quietly jumps on your lap or something like that. Docile, right? And then there are other dogs, you go near them, they growl and they get angry and this kind of a thing, right? And so those are the kinds of things that we might select for. So he says, how are these changes manifested in the relation of humans to animals? Well, first of all, the first area he talks about is size. Um, and size, which I found interesting because, from my point of view, I think, well, if we're going to be raising sheep, we'd want bigger, more, you know, more meaty kinds of sheep. But he says that cows, pigs, and sheep were all selected for smaller size, which made them somewhat easier to handle and easier to control in groups, right? And we'll see the issue of herds coming up, right? Okay. Others were selected for the retention of their fur, of, to make, like sheep, right? So that you can shear the sheep and use the fur that they have, right? Um, okay. So the author then goes on to discuss why it is that these animals um, and not other seemingly suitable candidates have been selected. Other seemingly suitable candidates in Africa and America have not been selected, while these animals have, right? Um, so he asks what I think for him is a kind of a critical question, right? Um, were there shared cultural barriers amongst um, shared structural cultural barriers? I guess someone knocking. I don't know who could be there. Must be a ghost, right? Shared shared cultural barriers in the human groups in places like California, um, in other places where it would seem like people there should have domesticated animals, but didn't, right? And so he says, um, okay, so let me see if I can frame this out for you so you understand it and it sounds right. He's asking the following question: was it the people, their intelligence, their culture, that prevented them from coming to an understanding of um, the food production revolution and its value? Or was it, in this case, looking at animals, was it something in the animal? And he's going to give us five, I believe it's five, one, two, three, four, five reasons why we can eliminate the idea of humans not being capable of doing it, and hence having to turn towards the animals themselves to see what characteristics are necessary in an animal for a group to choose them for the process of domestication. All right, let's see. So, five. He said the first thing is, okay, if these people were incapable of domesticating animals for cultural reasons or inadequacy of intelligence or anything like that that you'd like to throw out, why is it that as soon as the Eurasian major five species, so what were they? Sheep, goat, cow, pig, and horse. Once those five major species were introduced to them, they quickly domesticated them, took them into their homes, made them part of that process. So that would suggest that they were capable of handling domesticated animals and understanding their value, right? Second thing, he said pets. Look around the world. Virtually every group of people um, have pets. Pets taken out of the wild, tamed, trained, made part of the household, right? And he said you can get some pretty wild pets when you get down and dirty like he has and traveled around the world looking for things like that. But when you think about it, the process of taking a small animal out of the wild and making it, domesticating it, so it trusts you, it relies on you, it becomes dependent on you, is really the first step of domestication of larger animals, right? If they can do it with small animals, they can do it with larger animals. The dates of domestication. and this is kind of fascinating because he says that, look, between the year 8,000 and 2,500 BC, so that 4,500 year period, um, should be 5,500 year period. I think he says 4,500. Not so important. But during that 5,000 year period, um, peoples around the world had domesticated virtually all of the large herbivore mammals that are out there. So it would seem that the idea had spread, and people who came in contact with animals that could be of value to them and lent themselves to the process of domestication did what they do. They domesticated virtually every animal that was open to them and valuable to them. So those are three things so far. He said, then take it to the present, right? Oh, I see what he was saying. The 4,500 years ago, this process was closed. It was a process that lasted for 5,500 years. Jump to the present then. What have we attempted to do in the present? Well, as we've spread around the world with science and knowledge of biology and all these different things, we have attempted to domesticate other animals with virtually no success. Other large terrestrial herbivore mammals, we have failed to find any others to join with us. Okay. So I skipped one. Says, okay, going back again in time, he said, one of the things, and it's one of the things that, um, he certainly has covered, is that certain species, certainly of the major 5 species, were domesticated independently at different points in time in different places. That would suggest that even though those people are coming into the storehouse of species later, independently domesticated animals that, while they appear to be similar to sheep over here that were domesticated earlier, they represent an independent action like that, right? So that if we find that people are domesticating animals and repeating the experience of people, particularly in the Middle East, in terms of domesticating animals, there must have been something especially attractive in those animals to make them appeal to people, so that you have that happening, right? Okay. Let me see. All right. So, okay, I have the number here. Unfortunately, it's 134 species of large mammals. So the next question he's going to ask, I don't know whether you like it or not, but this is the way the author has structured the book in terms of a sort of a question thesis that he then addresses to it. But I think it helps you read it, so you can loop back and look at the question again and say, okay, this is what he's trying to answer with this information. Now I understand the question. Now I can see how he's working in his mind. He said, so the next question he's going to address is, why did the remaining 134 species, so I guess that would be 148 was the number of total species, the remaining 134 species failed to domesticate? And he gives us a list, right? And the list is rather interesting as to why it might be difficult for one species to do this. And he starts with the word diet. Let's see if I can find it. Diet. Oh, this is interesting. I'm glad I looked. He says every time that an animal eats a plant or another animal, the conversion of food biomass into the consumer's biomass involves an efficiency of much less than 100%. So what does he mean by that statement? Okay, so what he's saying is, first of all, biomass, right? Um, your body constitutes a biomass. If you were to be eaten by another animal, your body, to the extent that it was consumed, say the bones aren't consumed, this kind of a thing, but your flesh is consumed, that your flesh, that body biomass of your body is incorporated, just as when we eat, it's incorporated into us, right? Um, so there is less than 100% efficiency, which is to say, in terms of the food that goes into making me, if I get eaten by a lion, it's really not that efficient from the total point of view of what it took to feed me to get me to be this size, this weight, right? And what the lion then takes out of it will be much less than the total amount of biomass that I, I, I manifest, I have. Um, so this is the part that I think is fascinating for us. So the conversion of food biomass into the consumer's biomass involves an efficiency of much less than 100%, typically around 10%. That is, it takes around 10,000 pounds of corn to grow a 1,000-pound cow. So 10,000 pounds of corn to grow a 1,000-pound cow. If instead you want to grow 1,000 pounds of carnivore, maybe for a zoo, something like that, um, you have to feed it 10,000 pounds of herbivore grown on 100,000 pounds of corn. So to get to that point where you have raised um, a, a meat-eating animal, you have to kill so many animals that must have consumed so much more corn or grain to achieve their size than they're then fed to the meat-eating animal, right? And so this is one of the reasons, what he calls a fundamental inefficiency, why carnivores have not been domesticated, because they are just too expensive in terms of foodstuffs for humans to keep. By the time that animal is ready, what are you going to do? Eat it when it's an adult, and you have sacrificed um, what do you say, 1,000 pounds, uh, 10,000 pounds of cows to achieve 1,000 pounds of a lion, right? It's no longer worth it. So the diet is critical, what that diet is, right? The growth rate, how quickly it grows. The longer it takes for the animal to grow, the more time we have to feed it. And that's an inefficiency from the point of view of humans, right? Um, to be worth keeping, domesticates must also grow quickly. So that eliminates gorillas and elephants. Even though they are vegetarians, um, still, you would have to wait 10 years for an adult elephant or gorilla if you were going to raise them for purposes of eating them, I suppose. Problems of captive breeding, which is okay, interesting. Remember what we said? Domestication really involves um, the breeding of members of the same animal species so that they reproduce, and you take their children and you raise them, you breed them again, you eat them, you take their children, you breed them, this kind of a thing, right? I said, so humans don't like to have sex under the watchful eyes of others. Other potentially valuable animal species don't like to either. And it is interesting how every once in a while there'll be a spectacular piece of news on TV in the newspaper about an animal being born in a zoo in captivity. Well, that plays right into the hands of what he's talking about here, right? The challenge and the difficulty of getting animals to breed when they're not out on their own in the wild, enjoying their lives, right? And finding mates naturally as opposed to sticking an animal of the same sex to of an opposite sex together, right? To see if they will mate, right? And that eliminates certain other animals then from it. Nasty disposition. Okay. He says naturally, almost any mammal species that is sufficiently large is capable of killing a human. People have been killed by pigs, horses, camels, and cattle. But still, there are others that are much nastier, incurably dangerous, have tendencies to kill humans, and this fact disqualifies them from any concern with breeding. Tendency to panic. And so he gives us, if you will, say gazelle in parts of Africa. That you must have seen, on the on TV documentaries about animals in Africa and the gazelles, and you see them out there with the long horns, and they're there, and they perk their heads up, and they look around, and suddenly they're all looking around, they're all scared. Suddenly a lion appears, and they just take off, and they run in different directions, right? And I guess a cheetah could probably catch them, but the lions have to have combined forces of several of them to sort of circle them. But he's saying, how are you going to domesticate animals like that have this tendency to panic, right? When you're trying to control them. Okay, so the last characteristic that sort of would remove an animal from becoming a candidate for domestication is kind of interesting too. He talks about social structure. Almost all species of domesticated large mammals prove to be one whose wild ancestors share three social characteristics. They live in herds. So they live in herds in the wild, right? They live in herds. They maintain a well-developed dominance hierarchy. Everyone knows who's the boss, who's next, who's after that. Okay. So they maintain a well-developed dominance hierarchy among herd members. And finally, herds occupy overlapping home ranges. That means that they can drift into the range of others. Others can drift in. There's no conflicts between them. Okay. There's sort of an acceptance of them, right? Okay. So They occupy overlapping home ranges rather than mutually exclusive territories. Chimpanzees are known to be extremely territorial. And so, you know, there'll be sort of like no man's land border zones between one group of chimpanzees and a neighboring group of chimpanzees. And if one of the male members of Group A were to somehow just drift into the territory of Group B, they would quickly be surrounded, attacked, and possibly be beaten to death, right? And in fact, what anthropologists, in fact, people that I went to school with in graduate school, were actually studying is um, they would males would form raiding parties and go into neighboring territories and steal females and bring females back for purposes of breeding and keep them as captive breeders with them, right? And so there's this constant give and take between them, right? And so um, if you have an animal like that that has mutually exclusive and indeed antagonistic territories, um, they're hard to domesticate because how do you put them together one next to another? They'd be constantly fighting with each other, and that wouldn't work. Uh, so his example, which is kind of interesting, is herds of wild horses consist of one stallion, the dominant male, one stallion, up to half a dozen mares and their foals. So they're offspring, they're young horses, as it were. Um, Mare A is dominant over mares B, C, D, and E. Mare B is submissive to A, but dominant over C, D, and E. C is submissive then to A and B, but dominant over D and E, so on, right? And he says this social structure is ideal for domestication because humans, in effect, take over the dominance hierarchy. Domestic horses of a pack line follow the human leader as they would normally follow the top ranking female. Okay. Okay. So, in conclusion, then, of chapter 9, the answer to the initial question, like I said, go back to the initial question, why are so many species not chosen? So many species of mammals that exist on the planet, 148, and 134 were not chosen. Okay, so for reasons of diet, growth rates, etc., that listing that he gives you, right? Um, and then to put it a little bit closer to the thesis of the book itself, Eurasia, on the other hand, with many species, had a large number of appropriate species, not just like in Africa, large numbers of animals, but a large number of appropriate species in terms of the characteristics that we've just indicated that would make them suitable as candidates for domestication. All right, let's quickly finish the book then. Chapter 10 returns us to the question that we saw at the very start when we looked at, what was it, page 114, I believe it was, when we looked at this. Okay, it's over here. I got it. Mixing up two things. I hope. And that ain't it either. Farmer power. There it is. Okay. So, if you recall this, right? This chart on page 83. This chart here. Okay. So remember this chart has ultimate factors one side, proximate causes. No, excuse me. Ultimate factors deep into the past and proximate factors closer, and we follow through. The east-west axis then is listed as the truly ultimate factor, right? Um, Chapter 20 then is going to go in and sort of analyze this, having, as it were, developed the next box, many suitable wild species, is going to develop those next two boxes there, the east-west axis, the ease of species spreading. Okay, to explain why it is that a place like, um, uh, first, the Fertile Crescent, but much larger than that, the Eurasian landmass, given its vast east to west axis, is indeed the perfect place for this to occur, not only to occur in the Fertile Crescent itself, but then for the fruits of the food production revolution that occurs there to spread quite rapidly, from France on one side to China on the other side and filling in the spaces between, right? Um, so the axis orientation affected rates of spread for crops and livestock. In addition to the speed of spread is influenced by latitude and other intervening geographical factors. What he means is a broad east to west axis that exists in Eurasia enables the luck of the draw of the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent, which domesticates both plants and animals because they were both available, but then is able to spread far and wide and rather quickly. Whereas when you look at the other continents, they have essentially north-south axes. So North America to South America is a single north-south axis. Africa, the same thing, right? When you have an east-west axis and you have a single latitude, that means the weather and the climate is not going to change that much. And so what works here can quickly move over here. If indeed, and you might have to move slightly north, slightly south, but within a range, right, it's much easier to do that. If you're dealing with a continent like this and you want to go north to south, you're passing through climatic zones as you change latitudes. And that makes it extremely difficult for something that begins up here to move down here, right? Which is the basis of his point then, right? That the Eurasian peoples were able to develop first and then build on what they developed. Now we see, for example, in the Americas, as we will see, that America does develop food production and complex levels of civilization, but they got into the game much later, right? And so the types of societies that we encountered with the Aztecs or with the Incas were sort of, maybe 1,000 years behind us in terms of sort of the growth of technology and things like that. There are other limitations, the lack of mammals, right, to create draft animals. So they were limited by certain natural phenomena as well, right? Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed it. I suggest you try and read the book, but probably at another time, right? Maybe over the Christmas holidays, because it's kind of a fun book, and some of the best stuff is the stuff we left out from your point of view. Some of the more interesting phenomena, the Aztecs, the Incas, how they're conquered, right? This kind of a thing, right? What all this has to do with them, examples in some of the islands and things like that. So if you get a chance, please read it. Next week we will be getting back into the textbook. So, thank you.